Our next speaker is Dr. Mike Lohuis. Mike is Vice President of Research and Innovation at Semex, where he leads the development and execution of genetic strategies, programs, and solutions for clients worldwide. Prior to his work at Semex, Mike held a number of roles at Monsanto, including a Director of Environmental Strategy for Agriculture and its corporate engagement team, and also served leading Monsanto's animal genomics and breeding program and global plant breeding team. Prior to joining Monsanto, Mike was an assistant professor in animal science at the University of Guelph and was research project leader for the Canadian Association of Animal Breeders. Mike has obtained his PhD in animal breeding and bachelor's in animal science from the University of Guelph. And most recently, he leads Semex's team through the release of and successful adoption of methane efficiency evaluation. So kind of continuing our focus here a bit on methane, but Mike, which I think is a really interesting and important topic for our industry to grapple with. And I know through your work and adoption in the dairy space, maybe a bit ahead of us. So we've got some great opportunities to learn. So Mike, the stage is yours. We appreciate you being here. And yeah, so slides, the next slide in your notes, that's the current one that's up. There you go. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bob, for the introduction, and thank you, Kajal and John, for the invitation to speak to the who's who of the beef industry. And the tack I want to take on this talk is a little different. It's about the narrative around what we do, around animal breeding and around animal agriculture. And it's really important for all of us, I've found, to find our story and what the narrative is that we need to tell to perhaps change the narrative that's being told about us. I should back up and just say that there's two narratives. There's the narrative that we tell ourselves. And maybe I'm just going to skip ahead here and give you a little outline. First, I want to talk a little bit about the narrative. I'm gonna borrow a little bit about some of the stories that have evolved out of the dairy space, and then talk a little bit about beef on dairy, and then finish my talk about how we can reframe the narrative surrounding beef. So there's two narratives. There's the narrative we tell ourselves, which is really about high quality source of protein. It's enjoyable food. We have an enjoyable livelihood in animal agriculture. We're a large contributor to the economy, and it's vitally important for developing countries. But there's also the narrative that's told about our industry, about the animal industry. There's concerns about environmental impacts, animal welfare, antibiotic use, factory farms, resource depletion, deforestation. There's other concerns as well, but you get the picture. And the reason I wanted to talk about this, it's a little bit personal because, as Bob mentioned, I spent almost 20 years at Monsanto, and I had a front row seat to see how an external narrative can affect not just a multinational company, but a whole sector. And it's to the point, like, not just, I mean, you know the story of what happened at Monsanto. I think the leaders at Monsanto saw a different future for themselves. And to a large extent, they were constrained by that external narrative that was told about GMOs, that was told about glyphosate. So it's not something that we can allow others to frame that narrative about our industry. So how do you counter that narrative? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Where did some of this narrative around animal ag start? And when I returned to the animal industry after coming back from Monsanto, I was not surprised so much, but worried that some of the same narrative, and Peter mentioned it, you know, that was associated with some of our dirty fossil fuel industries, for example, are also being told about our animal industry. There was an FAO report that came out in 2006 called Livestock's Long Shadow. And it was a very thorough report. It got a few things wrong. So there were some flaws in the study, but They did talk about the livestock sector as a major player responsible for 18%. You can quibble about whether, you know, that was the right number or not, but they made a statement that this is a higher share of global emissions than transport. And that was flawed. That was not an apples to apples comparison. They looked at all the upstream emissions associated with livestock. They looked at what was the land use change associated with expansion of agriculture. With transport, they looked at what came out of the tailpipe. They didn't look at what happened upstream. And the problem is that meme, this is a higher share than transport, that meme stuck. It's stuck in the minds of consumers. It's stuck in the mind of policymakers. And that is a risk to our livelihoods and to our industry unless we can change that narrative. There was also a point made that the environmental impact per unit of livestock production must be cut in half just to avoid the increased level of damage beyond its present level. And it's a strong statement, but actually maybe they didn't go far enough. You know, maybe we needed to be starting to talk about net zero earlier. What they talked about here was, you know, cutting the intensity in half, but there's reasons why we need to actually go beyond that. And this slide shows the, as economies, as per capita income goes up, there's more meat consumption per capita. So when we think about the impact of animal agriculture, we know that whatever impact we have today, it's going to get bigger because populations are increasing, populations are getting wealthier, and as they get wealthier, they're going to want to eat more like we do, and I can't blame them. So we can't turn away from this issue. We have to figure out a way to reduce emissions, not just intensity, but actual absolute emissions as well. And I apologize, David, I'm going to talk some more about methane. But when you look at the IPCC reports, and you've all probably seen these pie graphs where energy, industry, ag, forestry, land use, transport, these are all the big emission factors. When you break down ag and forestry and compare it to transport, you can see that ag and forestry is made up of you know, forestry expansion around the world, land use change due to agriculture and other land uses. But when you break down agriculture, livestock and cropping are about equal, about 5% each. Now, if you consider some of the upstream parts of livestock, it's going to be more than 5%, but it's certainly not going to be equal to transport. Now, you can argue facts. It's hard to argue with facts when you have an existing narrative. We can also look at, since we're in Canada, we can look at Canada's emissions. Now it's different. We're a large country. We're wealthier, so we drive larger distances. We have more cars. So transport is about 4 times the size of livestock in Canada. Peter mentioned differences between extensive and intensive farming, and I thought it was interesting to look. And this is a dairy example where on the y-axis you have the emissions footprint in terms of intensity. This is CO2 equivalents per kilogram of fat-corrected milk. And on the bottom, the x-axis, you can see the level of production. And what you see is that as we get to the right, higher producing countries like USA, Spain, they do tend to have lower emissions intensity. But if you look in the sort of the middle area, New Zealand, Uruguay, you can achieve lower emissions intensity despite lower production and more extensive use. And so Peter mentioned taking a fork in the road, and as Yogi Berra said, if you come to a fork in the road, take it. And I think we really can see in both extensive and intensive systems, there are ways to achieve lower intensity and probably as well, lower absolute emissions as well. One important thing that is coming forward now is the idea that not all greenhouse gases are created equal and behave differently. And in this case, there's a big difference between CO2 and methane. CO2 is a stock gas. It lasts in the atmosphere for 1,000 years plus. Methane is very different. It's a short-lived greenhouse gas. After about 12 years, it degrades in the atmosphere. So when you look at the warming potential of methane, yes, it's a very potent greenhouse gas. It's 25 to 30 times the warming potential of CO2, but it also depletes. So what's really important, take-home message around methane is that what's more important than the amount, it's the rate of change. So if you are emitting less methane than you were 12 years ago, then the warming potential is not increasing. And there's an opportunity here for animal agriculture. So if we can decrease the amount of methane emissions more than we were used to historically, there's the potential to reduce the warming potential in our atmosphere. So there's a good story here to tell if you can tell it. So how do you counter the narrative when it's already out there? So why not just provide facts? You know, I can tell you firsthand, we tried that at Monsanto. It didn't work. You cannot argue with facts. When a meme is established, when a narrative is already established, when minds are set, the only way is to counter a negative narrative is with a positive narrative, and hopefully more than one positive narrative. So how many positive stories does it take to counter a bad story? I mean, Harvard Business Review will tell you, it takes about 6 positive messages to counter a negative message. In this case, it might even be more. The good news is that we have a lot of good stories. We have a lot of potential narratives that you're going to hear over the rest of this conference. And you already heard from Peter's talk that there are things that we are doing as animal breeders that would surprise people. And instead of just talking to ourselves about them, I think we need to be prouder and talk more broadly to more people about the kinds of things that animal agriculture and animal breeding in particular are doing. Now, borrowing from the dairy industry, Filippo is going to talk about approaching net zero. The Dairy Farmers of Canada have set this target of getting to net zero. This is not reducing emissions intensity. This is to get absolute emissions down to zero. And there's many reasons why you want to do that. But how you'll get there was modeled. Veresco Solutions is a modeling company that worked with Dairy Farmers of Canada to show what's possible by 2030 and what's possible by 2050. And by the time we get to 2050, the goal is to have emissions reduced to the amount that you can sequester them on the other side of the ledger. So they balance out at zero. But there's a lot of change that needs to happen. Now, they went on to model different parts of the dairy industry, everything from livestock management to land management. And clearly the biggest source of emissions is from livestock management, which is to a large part methane. So that's a target that I think we as animal breeders can actually do something about. If you look at emissions in Canada, roughly half is livestock management. And so, and that is mostly enteric fermentation or methane emissions. So this is a big target for us to work on. One thing that was learned along the way was that, yes, of course, diet, nutrition plays a very large role. And there are things we can do to the diet, excuse me, such as feed additives that can go a long ways to reducing that methane. But the animal and the microbiome play a very large role. About a third of the variation in methane emissions is controlled by a combination of the cow itself, as well as the rumen microbiota. Thank you. In fact, a larger part, the cow itself does control, to some degree, the composition of that microbiome. How it is done is not exactly clear. It could be some function of early programming at birth. It could be something that we know that if you depopulate the rumen microbiome and replace it with the microbiome of another cow, in fairly short order, it will revert back to where it started. So there's something going on with the host animal itself. And it turns out that you can actually, it is a heritable trait. I learned a new term this year, which is micro ability or microbio. I can't even say it. It's Filippo, you can explain it when you get up here. It's the degree of the microbiome that is heritable and affected by the cow's genetics. Another interesting development, a breakthrough really between the University of Guelph and Lactanet, was that you can use a proxy trait rather than measuring methane. You can get a proxy for that methane by measuring the mid-infrared spectra of the milk. And it so happens that we're quite lucky that we had been collecting this mid-infrared spectral data on 13 million cows, or 13 million records on 1.6 million cows. And that MEAR data was 70% predictive of the actual methane. But at a genetic sense, the genetic correlation was 92%. And we see that when you divide animals that are in the bottom or less than one standard deviation below the mean versus one standard deviation above the mean, you can see that the predicted matches pretty well with the actual methane. So it's a proxy trait that you can measure at low cost, at high numbers, is an excellent trait to put into a breeding program, given that collecting methane itself is quite expensive and it's hard to get the numbers. So in combination with Lactanet, Semex worked on a trait called methane efficiency, and it was designed to be independent of production. So it was corrected so that methane emission you could predict methane emission at the same level of milk, fat, and protein. So we're not giving up per se on production and production efficiency, but we can add this trait into the breeding goal. We're currently working on adding more phenotypes, herds, environments, so that we can look across more environments, like, for example, a more extensive environment, and see, can this work in a pasture environment as well? One thing if you model this forward, and the nice thing about genetic improvement is that it's permanent and it's cumulative. So each generation that you select on it, you add to the gains made in the previous generation. And if you can consistently select on this trait, you can achieve 20 to 30% reduction just by selecting on this one trait by 2050. That goes a long ways to helping Canada meet that net zero target. So can this open doors? Absolutely. We found that our CEO was in Ottawa talking about trade restrictions with some officials in Ottawa. And just in the midst of conversation, he mentioned, oh, by the way, we have this new trait called methane efficiency, so we can actually breed for lower methane cows. And the officials in the room, they stopped, and there was silence. And then there was why didn't you say something earlier? This is going to open all kinds of doors for trade. So this is a really important way to change that narrative. Yes, we do have emissions coming from ruminants, from cows, dairy, beef. We are emitting methane, but we're doing the right thing. We are selecting, we're improving. And that's really what consumers, they like eating beef. They like consuming dairy products. They want to keep doing it, but they want to feel good about it. So if we can show that we are making progress, it really does change that narrative. This is a story that I've been telling people outside of our industry. When I when they ask, well, what do I do? And I talk about some of the things we're doing. Do you think this can change the narrative? Absolutely. 100% of the people that I talk to about breeding for lower methane cows say, wow, I didn't know you could do that. That's really interesting. That's really cool. These are the kind of narratives that we need to look for, that we can tell our larger society that we're working towards actually making and addressing some of the concerns that they have about our industry. Question is, will farmers select on it? And I think that's really a story for another day. It all depends on market signals, as Peter mentioned, that we need to have those market signals to allow farmers to put weight on that selection. I'd like to switch gears a little bit to talk a little bit about animal health and welfare. The story that you hear told about the health and welfare of our animals is factory farming. Cows are in terrible condition. But what I see on the ground is much different. We now have so many farms that have expanded. Yes, they're bigger, but they've invested in cow comfort. They've invested in freestall operations. They've invested in milking robots. They've invested in robotic groomers. They pay a lot more attention to calf health. There's a lot more animal behavioral studies around, the health and welfare of our animals. And I think if you go to a dairy farm today versus 20 years ago, it's a completely different story. And when you go into a robot barn, those animals are very quiet. They're very calm. You can walk amongst them and they're not skittish. They have very little interaction with humans, actually. I don't know what they think about us. We just come and turn the lights on once in a while. But I do believe that there's a really good story to tell about the use of technology in how we manage cattle. And I think the same applies across the animal industry. The difficulty with improving it from a genetic sense is it's really difficult to obtain reliable health and management data. And as Peter mentioned, there's variation in management, and that tends to dilute the signal about what is truly heritable and what's not. Sensor data, and you see these cows wearing neck sensors, has the potential to get closer to the biology of the trait. So you take some of the management noise out of the picture. We've introduced a sensor, we call it Semex AI24. And as was mentioned, it was primarily meant to help farmers get their cows in calf, so they could tell when an animal, as she slowed down in her rumination, likely she was coming into heat. But it was also rumination slows when the animal is not healthy. And what we learned is that by using these sensors or ear tags are another option, you can identify sick cows 1 to 3 days sooner than just by observing them. So this was a good reason for farmers to purchase sensors, and they work very well in an intensive environment. We've got work to do, as Peter said, about more extensive environments. But we've learned that these sensors can tell us so much more about what's going on. In the top left, you'll see on the left, it's the number of minutes that an animal is inactive during the day. And a diseased animal has, particularly right after calving, there's a big difference in terms of the amount of activity. And if you're walking through the barn, you might see it. But if you've got sensors on those animals, you can really pick out immediately which animals are getting sick or are sick. We find that diseased animals eat less, they ruminate less, and they're just totally, they're less active in total. So can we use sensors for genetic evaluations? Well, one thing that we do know is that these sensor data are very convenient, they're cost effective. They're widespread in use already amongst the commercial industry, and we can achieve very high numbers of phenotypes. And what's really nice about this data is it's longitudinal, so you can see what's happening over time. So you can look at trends, increases, patterns, that you might not be able well, you certainly can't just from observing, let's say, disease incidents. And we know that rumination and rumination patterns have moderate heritability. So you can anywhere from 14 to 44% in one study. I would call these moderate heritabilities, moderate to high. But what's really important is that you define these traits so that they're correlated with true health traits or economic traits. There's enough information in the literature to encourage us to sponsor a study with the University of Guelph to look at these sensors. We were interested in how we could use them to breed for more fertile and more environmentally robust, more resilient cattle using these precision sensors. And a short story, what we learned was the activity related indexes can be used to define and evaluate estrus-related fertility traits. And I think fertility, to an earlier point, is an underrated trait. When you look at how we can decrease the footprint of agriculture, if we could improve fertility, you're improving the efficiency, and you don't need as large a herd, you don't need as many cows to produce the next generation. We also learned that activity derived traits are low to moderate heritability, and calving to the period of first high activity or first heat, we found reasonably higher heritabilities, and comparing it to the classic fertility traits, they're about double the heritability. So provided that we've defined them right and that they are correlated well to the classic traits, they can be an important proxy trait that we could use in our genetic evaluations. So some of the conclusions around sensors is that they are useful tools for monitoring health and welfare. Sensor data is very abundant, affordable, it's all longitudinal. There's a direct connection to economic traits. Otherwise, farmers wouldn't have invested in them to the first point. But there's a lot of data, and some of it's spurious. And so you have to be very careful to edit out some of those spurious data because they can really throw off an evaluation. But if you're thinking about genomics, what we can rely on are these reference populations of 5,000 to 10,000 animals. So it's very feasible to get sensor data from a population that size. And we know that we can breed for health and welfare traits like we weren't able to do before. And Peter made reference to how we screwed up fertility in the dairy industry, and it's true. Because it was a low heritability trait, we really couldn't put that much weight on it, and we couldn't make much progress. Now, with genomic evaluations, even for low heritability traits, we can make progress, and we've started to turn fertility back, and we're making positive progress again in our dairy breeds. What about disease resilience? So, we know that animals incur pathogens, they incur stress, and some of them get sick and some of them don't. Why is that? What's happening inside the immune system of animals? It's what's really happening inside that black box? And are there measures that are available to look into that black box? And we know that when we open up the black box, that the immunity does consist of several elements. And our relationship with the University of Guelph helped elucidate some of the elements that make up the immune system. We know that the adaptive immunity, which was what we worked on first, was antibody-mediated immune response, where you can measure, once you challenge an animal, you can look at how quickly that animal produces antibodies to react or to respond to that pathogen. We can also look at cell-mediated, so what's happening inside the cell. And this tends to be more protection against viral pathogens, which in the beef world may be more important than the antibody mediated response. Inside that is the innate immunity, which is really the first line of defense against invading microbes. This is like a very ancient type of immunity where there's no memory of past exposure to a pathogen. It's not really specific, and it doesn't last very long. but it does trigger the rest of the immune system, and it does prime that adaptive immune response. So it is an important part. We're starting to look into it. It's more difficult. We know that there are some in vitro tests that we can do, like, for example, measuring nitric oxide produced by macrophages. And you can measure that in vitro, so it can be a useful insight into the innate immunity system. These kind of measures tend to be all or none. Either an animal has that ability or it's lacking that ability. So it's a way of screening out animals that are, let's say, immune deficient from an innate immunity standpoint. So when you package all together, again, disease traits tend to be lowly heritable, but if you measure the elements of the immune system directly, you can come up with a measure that is moderate heritability, and you can make good response. At Semex, we've branded this as Immunity Plus, and it's been a very successful brand for us. One of the things we found is that these animals that are high immune responders tend to respond very well to vaccines as well. So if you invest in vaccines, you're going to get better bang for your buck if the animal's immune system is capable of mounting an immune response to that vaccine. And we also know that high immune animals do tend to pass on more of that immunity to the next generation through colostrum. To validate this, we looked at bull groups, so high immune bulls versus average bulls. And you can look at the incidence of different diseases, mastitis, lameness, etc., and what the cost of each of those diseases are. And when you add up the cost and the incidence over the lifetime of a dairy animal, you could see that high immunity sires were about $147 US better than their average herd mates. And if you go directly to the genomic test on the females, it's slightly larger because it's more of a direct measure on the animal itself. So Kajal is going to talk about this tomorrow. So I encourage you to listen into her talk. And what we've started was a research project. It was a few years ago already. And through COVID, it's been a slow process getting there. But what we're trying to do is translate this high immune response technology to beef. What's important is that you need to have a beef reference population, and working with American Angus, Canadian Angus was a really good opportunity to test this technology in a different industry. And we're learning a lot, and Kajal will tell you a lot about that. Some of the expected outcomes, we expect to see GEPDs and a genomic test for high immune response, and the livestock that bulls that are ranked highly for this. So we expect that when those animals get to a commercial feedlot, that we expect less mortality, more efficient growth, less greenhouse gas, and less antibiotic use. So the breeding industry is looking forward to this, and we hope to have those evaluations soon. I'd like to switch gears. Not sure what you're seeing. Okay, now I'm seeing it. So I'd like to move forward to, can we produce beef from the dairy herd? I think we skipped some slides, but that's all right. Yes, here we go. So as was mentioned, sex semen has really taken the dairy industry by storm, and it's displacing a lot of conventional semen. We found ourselves having a lot of excess heifers, and genomic testing allowed us to identify which animals we wanted to get and breed to sex semen. And this was an advantage for the dairy industry. We could get more replacements from the top end of our herd, so the replacements we were getting were much better. But it also opened up the rest of the herd for use in beef semen, and now it's standard practice. More than 90% of dairy farms are using beef on their dairy cattle. I wouldn't say it's the majority. I think not everybody's using 100% sex semen, although some farms are. But, we're seeing somewhere between 20 and 40% of the dairy herd is being bred to beef cattle. But we quickly learned that there's significant differences between dairy and native beef genetics when it comes to days on feed, dry matter intake, lower average daily gain, dressing percent. These are all deficiencies that need to be overcome. Marbling was actually a surprise that, these dairy beef animals can grade out pretty well. But the important thing is, how do we change the mindset of the dairy producer to turn a byproduct into a core product? And what we need them to do is to produce beef calves the same way as, with the same selection pressure as they put towards replacing females. And so they've learned from their mistakes already that it's more than just conception rate and calving ease and having a black calf. They know that they need to choose something that's going to compensate for some of those deficiencies of dairy genetics. And the dairy beef producers themselves are learning as well. They know they need to have good relationships with dairies, the calf buyers, so that they know that the genetics that they're getting are going to perform well in their feedlots. And they need to communicate those expectations. And then they need to understand how to manage them. We visited a 1,600 head beef feedlot, mostly dairy beef steers with some native cattle in there, as well, native beef cattle as well. And I thought it would be easier to tell them apart. And he was pointing out lots of dairy beef steers that I was convinced were native beef, but they were actually surprisingly well muscled. This farm also provided 3 carcasses for use in a demonstration with the Ontario Corn-Fed Beef Breeders Association. And so they all went in to the abattoir to look at these 3 carcasses. 2 of them were dairy beef, 1 steer and 1 female. And then the other carcass was an Angus steer. It was easy to pick out the dairy beef steer because it was longer. The conformation was certainly different, but most people had difficulty telling, the dairy beef heifer from the Angus steer. So they were about the same conformation and roughly the same kind of muscling, which was kind of surprising. And when you look at the muscle structure and function, we know that Holstein tends to have lower dress, smaller ribeye steaks, but now we're starting to see that beef on dairy, if done right with the right genetics, you can approximate more of a native beef type of loin, for example. And even the color, although it's still a little variable, is more close to a native beef animal. And we're still seeing variability in muscle shapes in those crossbreds. When we visited that farm, we did see a lot of variability, and he was pointing out, well, okay, that's what I want to see more of. That's what I want to see less of. So clearly he knows that he needs to be a little bit more careful in what he's bringing in to his feedlot. So in summary, sire selection for dairy beef is critical to address some of those deficiencies. One of the things that we're hearing more about is liver abscesses, and I don't know why, but it seems to be higher for the dairy and the dairy beef, perhaps because we are pushing them harder. We're feeding more grain. Native beef tend to handle this better. So this is something that we need to figure out how to manage. But we know that it's worth it because, as was mentioned earlier, the dairy beef animal starts its life with about 40% less emissions. It has that, it's sharing, the emissions from producing that calf is shared between the dairy herd and the beef feedlot. And so you've got an advantage starting with dairy beef from an emissions standpoint, but you can give it up in a hurry if you don't have the right genetics and if you don't have the right management. But it can be another way to change the narrative around beef to say, there is low impact or low footprint beef. We know that there's a shortage of feeder cattle and they're very expensive. And so the dairy beef industry can step in and provide some of those animals to keep a reasonable supply and keep the cost of beef from becoming a luxury item. So let's talk a little bit about reframing the narrative around beef. So you're going to hear over the next couple of days about many innovations that could improve the sustainability of beef production. But have we communicated them? Have we talked to each other, or have we talked to other people? And can we give equal time to what consumers care about, not just what we as an industry care about? And I want to point out a group called Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. And what they point out is that sustainability at its core is about meeting the needs of the present without compromising future generations' ability to meet their needs. And at its core, it's about efficiency. So can we produce more with less? And so their vision is for the Canadian beef industry to be recognized globally as a socially responsible, environmentally sound, and economically viable. So there's a lot of things that they've done. The first thing they did was bring together many partners from all the way from producers to consumers, consumer groups, and they've all played a part in forming this vision and talking about what they need to do to change the narrative around beef. They have a mission that includes benchmarking, which is important to have the facts, projects and initiatives that show how sustainability is being improved, and they're producing a framework that certifies that these improvements are being made. But they also provide a lot of help in terms of communicating and engaging the rest of society with what's going on with sustainable beef. There's some new data coming out about some of this benchmarking later this fall, which is going to show the improvements that the beef industry has made. And I think it'll be a good opportunity to showcase how we are making those improvements. There's a lot of goals. There's a lot of interesting things that would, I think, be surprising to the broader society, like can we maintain and enhance 60% of wildlife habitat? Can we reduce food waste by 50%? And of course, they've got efficiency and greenhouse gas emissions intensity in their goals. Some of the things when they talk about the environment. So there's a unique environment in the grasslands that does host a number of species other than cattle. So there's a lot of wildlife, and they have this really nice video about an endangered species of hawk that makes its home and is actually regaining its population in the grasslands. And they've talked about other projects that demonstrate at a small level, but there's a lot of stories that can be told. They've also partnered with Environment Canada on conservation action plans. One of the things they've done, though, is they've created some videos. And when you're engaging the public, we know that video is the most powerful medium. And I have a couple of short ones here, and I'll just play through them.
Cattle just share the ecosystem. They don't use it completely. They just share it with everything else. And that's what's really special, is that cattle are able to be a part of the ecosystem without damaging it, but actually to benefit it.
There's also another couple of short cookies here. So just, really short, quick hit videos, but you can fit them in and our attention span can handle a video of 10 seconds or 20 seconds. There's also work that the Canadian Roundtable has sponsored around short documentaries, and there's a really nice one around Guardians of the Grassland. So if you Google Guardians of the Grassland, you can see this 12-minute documentary, which does a nice job of describing why we need to protect the grasslands and how beef ranching does a great job. It's a wonderful narrative to counteract some of the things that they're hearing. So just wrapping up, you know, there is a challenging narrative that has formed around animal agriculture. We as animal breeders, we have the tools, we have the skills to meet the expectations of industry and society, but we need to tell that story. You know, how animal breeding and management tools can mitigate climate change, can improve animal health and welfare, and provide more sustainable beef at the same time as improving the environment. And I think, given all of the discussion, that society is actually more open to hear about how science and technology can provide solutions, particularly if we can show how we're moving things, we're addressing their concerns, and we're moving things forward. Thank you very much for your attention. Okay, so I guess we have time for questions. Oh.
So, yep, there we go. Yeah, Mike, I was having lunch with a scientist last week and they ordered an Impossible burger, and we're having the sort of discussion about, you know, greenhouse gas stuff and all this sort of thing. And he was very much of the view that one of the one of the problems for us, or the perceptions, is that big ag is sponsoring a whole lot of greenwash, you know, to sort of downplay and hide from the, this problem. So how do we overcome, you know, that sort of response? Do you see that? Is that something we need to get over, or, you know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. There's a lot of groups that are allergic to greenwashing, and you know, they can pick it out when it's not backed up by science. And so I think when you look at what Canadian Roundtable is doing, they're backing it up with benchmarking. They're finding ways to document the improvement. So greenwashing is when you talk about, you know, what the great things you're doing, but you don't have any facts to back it up. You can't show what technologies you're actually implementing or how you're making that change. So yeah, I think the important part is that we as scientists have to be able to come back with, okay, here's specifically what we're doing. Here's the technology that is, you know, reducing methane. This is improving efficiency. This is actually by increasing the productivity per acre, you know, we are preserving more land. And if you can make the argument that shows, you know, what we're actually doing and how it's making a difference, I think you get over that greenwashing criticism. But you're right, we have to be careful that we only talk about things that we can back up.
Yeah, Mike, a question about your experience so far in selecting for that mid-infrared predictor trait for methane intensity. And have you seen any correlated responses? So I'm thinking back to Peter's point, and that I think goes back to some work that was done in New Zealand around sheep, where they had high and low methane emitting sheep, but they could run the sheep through a CT scanner. And so then they could see the low emitting sheep had smaller rumens. Yep. And so I'm just, you know, I think obviously I'm not a dairy cattle breeder, but enough dairy cattle talks, they always talk about capacity and cows that can, you know, consume a lot of feed. So if you have a pencil gutted Holstein with a small rumen, are you going to be able to sell that semen, I guess? Are you going to monitor that as a correlated trait in the Holsteins? Have you seen any effects? Or
yeah, absolutely. What we have done so far is we've looked at the other traits that we do have, right? So we can look at all the major traits that farmers select on today. when the first version of that trait was really just methane production. And what we found was a fairly unfavorable correlation with fat, which fat percent and fat yield in the milk. And that stands to reason because the mid-infrared is picking up volatile fatty acids. And so we realized, like, okay, this is a problem. We can't be selecting for a trait that's going to decrease fat yield, because that's how farmers are paid. So we reconfigured the trait so that it was going to be independent of milk, fat, and protein. And that made it actually fairly independent of most other traits. There were a couple of traits that we do select on today, and Filippo will remember them, so he can mention them in his talk, but they were actually favorable. What we haven't done is we haven't run cattle through a CT scan. We don't know exactly how that, the animal, how the host is changing, the spectra of the milk, and how it's actually changing the methane that's being emitted. It could be a combination of, somehow controlling the microbiome, and it could be a change in physiological characteristics of the animal. I think that's still yet to come. So certainly more data from more herds and more environments is going to answer that story.
Hey, Mike. Question about the narrative aspect of your talk and how we can shift that. I was wondering what your thoughts are on, the cow-calf sector being kind of like the most methane intense emitting sector, but also when you showed some of the goals and the stats from CRSB about wildlife habitat capacity and protecting endangered ecosystems and wetlands and that sort of thing. Do you think that with consumers, we can counter the narrative and say, yes, this is the most methane intense part of our industry and all these other benefits with grasslands and wildlife habitat capacity, or are those other things always going to be overshadowed by methane?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Lindsay, because it's true. The cow-calf sector is a large source of emissions in the beef industry. Certainly one way you can, by getting more of the calves from the dairy industry, you kind of reduce the total emissions from the cow-calf sector. And you do have a more sustainable product that you can put on the market for consumers that care about that. But when it comes to the existing cow-calf, there's no reason why, if we can find the right traits to select on to reduce methane from the cow-calf sector, that's a very good target. And it's something that we can talk about. It's not, there's trade-offs, right? You have, you're keeping the grasslands, you're protecting the grasslands, you're protecting the environment in the grasslands, but you also need to improve the cattle to address some of those societal concerns about that part of the sector. So I think if we do our jobs right, and if we can find an appropriate proxy in the beef world, and I think there are some, it won't be mid-infrared spectra on milk, but it will be, there will be other measures that we can use to do the same kind of thing in the beef world as we've done in dairy.
Thanks, Mike. David Jellick, thanks for supporting the fertility initiative. That's a great thing. In changing the narrative, so all these folks are in Canada, many of whom maybe it's the first time to Canada. Do they recognize that 30% of the global forest cover is in Canada, about 300 billion trees? Do those assets get quantified for the carbon that they sequester in these numbers and the initiative to drive for a goal, which I don't think is a realistic goal, net zero by 50? I think you indicated that it's a lofty goal, but I would challenge you on that. Where does the sequestration of carbon and the 300 billion trees that we have in this nation, at least, how does that fit the narrative, and why don't we use it more? Because I think this focus on cattle should be shifted to the fact that that we don't have a problem with emissions, at least regionally. Now, maybe globally there is a problem. I'm yet to be convinced that we can model these temperature changes, but we're here to have a discussion. So I'm going to pull back the scab.
I'm not sure I can convince you from the podium here, but I do think that you raise a couple of issues. One is, setting net zero targets for Canada or for a particular part of the industry. Yes, it's difficult, and yes, it's going to take a lot of innovation to do that. When it comes to sequestration of carbon, that is part of the goal. You can manage your croplands in a way that is going to sequester more carbon. You can preserve grasslands. That's vitally important. The moment you put a plow into a pasture, you've released a lot of carbon. However, let's say we can make beef production more efficient globally, and we can stop the expansion of the footprint of agriculture to feed our livestock, to feed people. If we can be more efficient and we can reduce the footprint, now we can start to return some land, maybe marginal land, back into forest or wetlands or carbon sequestering uses. So I think that can be a part of the solution. It's going to be difficult to get credit for that, because some things like soil organic carbon, it can easily be reversed. If that land is tilled, that carbon that was being stored gets re-released. So it's when it comes to carbon markets, that's a real tough one. I would argue that if we're reducing methane through dietary measures or breeding measures, that's permanent and cumulative, should be easier to get credit for than it would be for things that are maybe less permanent. So you had a sort of a long question. I had a long answer. I'm not sure I got to, the gist of it, but yeah, I do believe that it's a really difficult problem to get credit and to reach net zero. And we're going to need every tool, not just breeding, but land management, expansion of carbon sequestering land uses to get there.
Thank you, Mike. Great presentation. Peter just talked briefly 1 second ago about Impossible Burger. So the question is, you haven't talked about synthetic meats, synthetic products that are coming. And of course, the narrative that they're telling us about trying to commoditize, food, and being probably in the hands of few conglomerates, I guess.
Yeah. One thing that I feel we have as an advantage is we've been eating beef, we've been eating meat for a long time, and it's served us very well. When you talk about synthetic meat, you're talking about something completely new. And it's certainly not natural, at least the way that we perceive natural foods. So I think the synthetic meat industry has a big hill to climb. One, it's not a natural source of meat production. Two, the economics aren't working yet. There's a lot of infrastructure required, and those, it's possible that you can avoid some of the emissions that we have with livestock for sure, but there's also a fairly large infrastructure cost, and I don't think the economics are going to work yet for some time.